In the summer of 1820, a crowd gathered on the courthouse steps in Salem, New Jersey. They had come to watch a man die. Robert Gibbon Johnson, a local gentleman farmer, stood before them, holding a basket of bright red tomatoes. He announced he intended to eat them, all of them, right there, in public. The crowd pressed closer. A physician in the front row had reportedly brought his medical bag, certain he would be needed. Women in the crowd shielded their eyes, because every educated, reasonable person standing on those cobblestones knew that the tomato was a poison fruit. That if you ate one, you would foam at the mouth, your skin would blister, and you would be dead before sunset. Johnson raised the first tomato to his lips and bit down. The crowd went silent. He chewed, he swallowed, he reached for another, and nothing happened. But here is what is strange, and this is the part most people never think about. The crowd was not entirely wrong. There really was something dangerous about the tomato, just not what anyone thought. Think about that for a moment. A fruit eaten daily by millions of people across 2 continents, a fruit that had fed the Aztec Empire for centuries, arrived in Europe and was declared, almost immediately, unfit to eat. And that verdict held. For roughly 300 years, 3 centuries, 12 generations of Europeans and their colonial descendants looked at a tomato and saw poison. Physicians warned against it. Herbalists catalogued its dangers. Housewives kept it off the table as a matter of common sense. And the strange thing, the thing that makes this story genuinely interesting, is that they were not reasoning from nothing. They had evidence. People got sick. People died. The tomato was present at the scene. They just had the wrong suspect. The fear was real. The deaths were real. What the crowd got wrong was the cause. That gap between a genuine pattern of illness and a completely mistaken explanation is what kept one of the most nutritious foods on Earth off European plates for 300 years. It is what shaped which countries adopted it early and which ones held out. It is what drew a boundary, invisible but firm, between the Mediterranean world and Northern Europe, between Catholic kitchens and Protestant ones, between the people who discovered that tomatoes could build a cuisine and the people who were still calling them ornamental curiosities. All of that, all of it, traces back to one overlooked detail about who owned the plates. But before we get there, we need to understand where the tomato actually came from, because the story of what it is begins roughly 10,000 miles from the table where it was condemned. 10,000 years ago, no one planted it, no one tended it, no one feared it. It simply grew, a small, hard, yellow-green berry clinging to steep hillsides in what is now Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, scattered across elevations that would kill a cornstalk. The plant was part of the nightshade family, which already had a reputation. Deadly nightshade, henbane, mandrake. The genus carried darkness like a surname, but the wild ancestor of the fruit the world would one day call poisonous was, at this stage, mostly ignored. Too small, too bitter, too much effort for what it gave back. Then, something shifted, not overnight, over generations. Sometime around 2,600 years ago, in the valleys of southern Mexico and northern Guatemala, Mesoamerican farmers began selecting the plants that gave more, bigger fruit, more flesh, easier seed. The process was slow and invisible, the way all domestication is. No single moment of invention, just thousands of quiet choices made by people who kept what worked and discarded what didn't. Mexico's agriculture ministry places this domestication at roughly 2,600 years ago, and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency identifies Mexico as the most probable center of diversification for the cultivated species. What emerged from that long selection was something closer to what we would recognize today, the jitomate, a name drawn from the Nahuatl word tomatl, meaning the swelling fruit. For the civilizations that grew up around this fruit, there was no debate about whether it was safe to eat. It simply was food. The Aztecs were folding it into their cooking long before any Europeans set eyes on the American continent. Markets in Tenochtitlan, the capital city built on an island in a lake, its population rivaling the largest cities in Europe, sold it alongside chilies, squash, and maize. Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagún, writing in the 16th century, described vendors offering large tomatoes, small tomatoes, leaf tomatoes, thin tomatoes, sweet tomatoes. The variety alone tells you this was not a novelty. This was infrastructure. The fruit arrived on the Spanish table when explorers carried seeds back from Mexico in the early 16th century. It crossed the Atlantic as a curiosity, something observed, collected, categorized. By around 1542 to 1544, a specimen was being recorded in a herbarium in Ferrara, Italy. By 1548, a letter documented the fruit arriving at the household of Cosimo de' Medici in Florence, referred to as pomidoro, golden apple. Think about that. The Aztecs had built an entire culinary culture around this fruit. They had named it, bred it, traded it in open markets for centuries. And the Europeans who received it named it after gold, and then, within a generation, decided it would kill them. Here is the problem the Europeans faced in the 1540s, and it was a genuinely reasonable one. The plant that arrived from the New World belonged to a family called Solanaceae, the nightshades, and in 16th century Europe, that family had a reputation. Deadly nightshade, belladonna, grew in the hedgerows and churchyards of the continent. A handful of its berries could kill a child. Henbane, another family member, caused convulsions. Mandrake root was used as a sedative so powerful that medieval surgeons called it the herb of Circe, after the sorceress in Homer who turned men into pigs. The entire clan was associated with poison, witchcraft, and a fast death. And here, arriving from an empire the Spanish had just finished dismantling, was another member of that clan, with a red berry the size of a man's fist, arriving on a ship from a continent no European had heard of a generation earlier. The suspicion was not superstition. It was pattern recognition. Pietro Andrea Mattioli, the Italian physician who wrote the first European description of the plant in 1544, categorized it with other mischievous herbs. He did not say it would kill you outright. He said it was eaten in some parts of Italy with oil, salt, and pepper. But the framing, nightshade family, exotic origin, unverified safety, meant the plant entered the European imagination already wearing a warning label. Mattioli's caution was the reasonable position of a careful scientist applying the best logic available to him. The problem was what happened next. That caution curdled, over decades, into something far less rational. There was also the matter of the plant itself. Raw tomato stems and leaves do contain tomatine, a compound that in large doses causes cramping and nausea. An animal the size of a large dog, around 100 pounds, would need to consume a significant quantity of leaves to feel those effects, and ripe fruit carries very low levels. But in an era before food chemistry, no one was running controlled trials. What people had were anecdotes. A wealthy guest dines, eats from a pewter plate, because pewter was the tableware of the prosperous classes. The tomato's acidity pulls lead from the metal, and by morning the guest is ill. The tomato gets the verdict. The pewter goes unexamined. That cycle repeated itself through the second half of the 1500s, and by the time a comprehensive English herbal was published in London in 1597, calling the plant rank and stinking, its author was not inventing a fear. He was codifying one that had already been building for half a century. The original 1597 edition was the work of John Gerard, a surgeon and keen gardener who moved in Elizabethan circles. But the version that shaped generations of readers was the 1633 revision, substantially expanded and corrected by Thomas Johnson, a botanist who improved the text considerably, yet kept the essential verdict on the tomato intact. It is this combined work, Gerard and Johnson's Herbal, that became the standard botanical reference for English-speaking readers for generations. Think about that timeline. A text first published in 1597, overhauled in 1633, shaped how people in Britain and its North American colonies thought about this plant for more than 200 years. That is not a rumor. That is institutional inertia at the scale of centuries. And there is something else worth noting about how the fear propagated. Each new herbalist who consulted the previous one reinforced the verdict without going back to examine the original evidence. Nicholas Culpeper cited the nightshade connection as settled fact. The chain of authority grew longer with each passing decade, and no one at any link in that chain had reason to question the foundational observations, because those observations, viewed narrowly, were accurate. Wealthy people had gotten sick. That part was true. Everything else was inference. The nightshade association gave the fear its logic. The pewter plates gave it its evidence, and the printed herbal gave it its authority. By 1600, the case against the plant felt airtight. It was also, on every material count, wrong. Here is the part that changes everything. The deaths were real. The illnesses were real. Wealthy Europeans sat down to dinner, ate something red and acidic served on their fine pewter plates, and fell sick. Some died, and because the sick were the ones who could afford pewter, and the poor who ate off wood or clay had no such problems, the pattern looked obvious. Blame the food. Blame the red thing nobody had heard of before the Spanish ships arrived. But the red thing was not the killer. The plates were. Pewter in the 16th and 17th centuries was an alloy. Tin, blended with lead, sometimes as much as 30% lead by composition. It held its shape beautifully. It polished to a near silver sheen. It was expensive enough to signal status, and common enough that any merchant household could afford a full set. It was also, when exposed to anything acidic, quietly lethal. The acid pulled lead ions out of the metal surface and dissolved them directly into the food. A single meal served on a pewter plate, dressed with vinegar or lemon or the juice of a sliced, ripe, aggressively acidic specimen of Solanum lycopersicum, could deliver a meaningful dose of lead to the person eating it. Think about that. The wealthiest tables in Europe were the most dangerous tables in Europe, not because of what was on the plate, but because of the plate itself. Lead poisoning does not announce itself. It mimics other things: nausea, fatigue, cramping, confusion. In an era with no germ theory, no toxicology, and no way to test what was in anyone's blood, a physician watching a patient deteriorate after a meal had only one variable to interrogate. What did they eat that was unusual? And there, bright red, foreign, smelling faintly of something green and unfamiliar, sat the obvious answer. The diagnosis was wrong. The conviction was total. Pewter was not a peasant material. It was a status object. The same households that could afford it were the households whose opinions became medical literature, legal precedent, and public consensus. When a wealthy merchant in Ferrara or a landed gentleman outside London reported that the red Spanish orb had made him violently ill, that report traveled upward, into herbals, into translations, into the correspondence of physicians who had never personally tried one. The poor, eating off wooden boards, were never part of this conversation. They were also not dying of lead leaching from their tableware. The irony is almost architectural. The very wealth that gave a man the authority to condemn a food was the same wealth that gave him the poisoned plate he ate it from. None of this was understood at the time. The chemistry of lead dissolution was not described until the 19th century. The relationship between pewter alloy composition and acid exposure was not something any 16th century kitchen would calculate. What they had instead was correlation. Red food, sick person. Correlation held for 200 years, passed from one herbalist to the next, from printed edition to translated edition, from every physician who trusted the accumulated printed word over the evidence of his own stomach. The toxicology was also almost right in one narrow respect. The green parts of the plant, the stems, the leaves, the unripe flesh, do contain tomatine, a compound that in large quantities causes genuine gastrointestinal distress. But ripe fruit, the kind actually eaten, carries only trace levels. The plant was guilty of association. It grew in the same family as nightshade. It looked dangerous. It smelled sharp and green when you handled the vine. And it had the bad fortune to arrive at the exact moment European tables were poisoning their owners from underneath the food. For 2 centuries, the wrong defendant absorbed the sentence. Here is the detail that changes everything. The people who got sick from eating off pewter were not everyone. They were the wealthy, nobles, merchants, scholars, the class that could afford plates cast from expensive alloys. And that is exactly the class that wrote the books. Pietro Andrea Mattioli was a physician to the Habsburg court. The herbalists who circulated warnings in English moved in the circles of Elizabethan gentry and educated readers who owned libraries. The men who declared the red fruit dangerous were the same men who sat at the tables where the danger was real, because the danger was underneath the food, not in it. Think about what that means structurally. The same social position that granted a man the education to publish, the Latin to be read across borders, and the reputation to be cited by successors, that same position guaranteed that his dining experience was mediated by lead-laced metal. His report was honest. His conclusions were shaped entirely by an invisible variable he had no framework to detect. He was not lying. He was a careful observer of a rigged experiment. Think about that. A physician observes that wealthy diners fall ill after a meal. He records the symptoms. He identifies the unfamiliar ingredient on the plate. He publishes his verdict in Latin, in a bound volume, in an edition that circulates across 3 countries. The poor farmer who ate from a wooden bowl experienced nothing of the kind. His digestion was fine, but he wrote no herbals. He gave no testimony that entered the record. His experience did not travel. The wooden bowl left no footnote. This is how misinformation calcifies into consensus. Not through lies exactly, through an incomplete sample that mistakes itself for the whole. The wealthy got sick. The record said so. The poor did not get sick. The record said nothing. And because absence of evidence is invisible, the consensus read as unanimous when it was in fact a portrait of one class drawn as if it were all of humanity. For 2 centuries, that gap held. Southern Italy was the first place the calculus began to shift, not because scientists ran controlled trials, but because the poorest populations in Naples and Sicily had been quietly eating the red fruit since at least the early 1700s, mixing it into ragu and spreading it over bread as a cheap way to add flavor to almost nothing. They were not dying. They were, by most accounts, feeding themselves through conditions that killed people by other means entirely. But Naples was not London, and London wrote the consensus. The pattern is older than the tomato and younger than yesterday. The people with access to platforms decide what counts as knowledge. The people without access to platforms keep living their actual lives, and those lives go unrecorded until someone, eventually, decides to look. By the time the fear crossed the channel into England, it had hardened into doctrine. The nickname says everything: poison apple. Not suspicious apple, not unfamiliar apple. Poison. That word is a verdict, not a question. And in the Northern European imagination of the 17th century, the verdict stuck fast. England had no tradition of eating the thing at all. Wealthy households grew the vines in their gardens, yes, but as decoration, the same way they might display an exotic curiosity brought back from abroad. The bright red or gold clusters made handsome ornament against a stone wall. Nobody cut them open. Nobody cooked them down. The gap between the planter's spectacle and the planter's dinner was not a small one. It was, for most English men and women of that era, an uncrossable distance. The printed herbals had given this distance its intellectual respectability. A bound book, published in London, written by men with gardens and titles, that carried weight that rumor alone could not. Their verdict circulated for generations. When parents warned children away from the garden beds, when physicians cautioned patients, when writers reached for an example of a foreign curiosity that had turned out to be dangerous, the herbal tradition was the reference sitting underneath the claim, even when the claimer had never read it. The irony cuts cleanly. The English wealthy, the only class with reliable access to both the plants and the printed warnings, were also the only class eating regularly from the lead-laced tableware that was actually doing the poisoning. They had the wrong cause and the wrong defendant, but they had a coherent story, and a coherent story is extraordinarily hard to dislodge. Think about that. 2 centuries of English-speaking distrust, Britain and the colonies it would eventually plant across the Atlantic, all traceable to a single decade of misdirected fear at one end of the social order and one influential tradition of printed authority at the other. The vine kept growing, the fruit kept ripening, and the table kept refusing it. Somewhere else, an entirely different set of facts was developing. Here is where the story gets stranger. The botanical name that scientists eventually assign to the cultivated vine is Solanum lycopersicum. Break that down. Lyco, from the Greek lykos, meaning wolf. Persicum, peach. The wolf peach. Even the taxonomists were spooked. The name did not arrive by accident. It carried centuries of accumulated dread. Solanum is the nightshade genus, the same family that gives you belladonna, the poison that Renaissance women dripped into their eyes to dilate their pupils at court, and mandrake, the root that medieval folklore insisted screamed when you pulled it from the ground. To classify the new arrival inside that family was not a neutral act. It was a verdict, and the folklore moved in fast. In parts of northern Europe, the vine became tangled with witchcraft. The scarlet globes hanging heavy on the stem looked, to suspicious eyes, exactly like the kind of thing a witch would grow. Bright, seductive, almost theatrical. Too beautiful to be safe. In some German-speaking regions it was called der Liebesapfel, the love apple, and the suspicion ran both ways, that it inflamed desire as easily as it delivered poison, a fruit that might kill you or bewitch you, depending on the dose. Think about that framing for a moment. The same object that the Aztecs had been selling in open markets for generations, that Cosimo de' Medici's household had noted in an accounting letter like an unremarkable delivery, was being processed in Northern European imagination as a cult material. The science did not help either. The leaves and stems do contain a compound called tomatine, real, measurable, capable of causing genuine distress in large quantities. The ripe flesh contains almost none. But folklore does not read chemistry papers. It reads shapes. It reads color. It reads which genus something belongs to. And this one belonged to nightshade. While England was posting warning signs, France was writing love letters. The French did not call it poison. They called it la pomme d'amour, the love apple. The name carried weight in the 16th century. Apples were already loaded with Edenic symbolism. Adding love to the equation placed this red, gleaming, seed-filled thing squarely in the territory of desire and transgression. And that is exactly where it stayed, for a long time. France accepted the visual drama of the vine before it accepted the plate. Aristocratic gardens in the Loire and Burgundy grew the plant as an ornamental curiosity. It was theatrical. The fruit hung heavy and red against dark green leaves, and it looked like something that belonged in an allegory. Painters noticed. Poets noticed. Cooks for most of the 1600s did not. The aphrodisiac reputation spread partly through that name and partly through the logic of appearances. Red equaled heat. Heat equaled passion. This was not medicine. It was the doctrine of signatures, the old belief that a thing's outward form announced its inward power. The heart-shaped variety, deep red and glossy, practically made the argument itself. Nobody was eating it. They were admiring it, coveting it even. The forbidden fruit framing kept it desirable in a way that straight poison warnings never could. Because desire and danger are not opposites, they are neighbors. Slowly, cautiously, the French kitchen began to test the boundary. Not dramatically, not all at once. A sauce here, a condiment there. By the late 1600s, in the south especially, closer to Spain, closer to the Mediterranean, the love apple was finding its way past the garden gate. It had taken over a century, but it was moving. While England was printing warnings and France was keeping it behind garden walls, something quietly different was happening in the Italian south. Not in the courts of Florence, not in the libraries of Bologna. In the kitchens of Naples, where the plates were clay, the tables were wood, and no one had read the English herbals. The chemistry worked in their favor without anyone knowing it. Clay does not leach. Wood does not leach. So when an acidic red ingredient landed on a clay surface, nothing was transferred but flavor. The same reaction that had sickened wealthy diners off Pewter was simply absent, erased by poverty, by material circumstance, by the accident of what a peasant family could afford. By the late 17th century, the Lazzaroni, Naples's street poor, were eating the red ingredient with flatbread and olive oil in combinations that would be recognizable today. No ceremony, no theory, no botanical classification, just hunger, availability, and the discovery that it tasted extraordinary. The gap between what the wealthy feared and what the poor ate was roughly 100 years. That is how long it took for the ledger to start correcting itself. Not through science, not through royal decree, but through the relentless, unrecorded daily practice of people who had no other option and found, in that constraint, something worth keeping. The word that traveled north from those kitchens was not medical. It was culinary. Cooks began writing it down, not as a curiosity, not as an ornamental note, but as an ingredient with properties, with uses, with a role in a dish. The vine that had spent a century as a garden spectacle was crossing a threshold. The first Italian cookbook to include a recipe using the red ingredient appeared in 1692, Antonio Latini's Lo scalco alla moderna. His salsa di pomodoro alla spagnola called for roasting it directly in flame, then combining it with chopped onion, chili pepper, thyme, and salt. The finished sauce weighed almost nothing to make. The ingredients cost almost nothing to buy. And it was, by any contemporary account, delicious. Think about that date, 1692. 95 years after the English herbal declared it rank and stinking. Nearly 150 years after the first documented specimen arrived in European hands. And the gap between those two facts is the entire story of how fear outlasts evidence by generations. Latini's recipe was not a revolution, it was a record. The written confirmation of something that had already been happening in southern Italian kitchens for decades, spreading block by block through Naples the way any good and cheap food spreads. Through neighbors, through markets, through the simple arithmetic of taste. Naples at the time held roughly 200,000 residents packed into one of Europe's most densely populated cities, more people per street than almost anywhere on the continent. When something cheap and flavorful entered that density, it did not stay contained. It moved at the speed of hunger. By 1700, the red sauce was Neapolitan. By the mid-1700s, it was Italian. By the time the rest of Europe finally began to reconsider its verdict, Italy had already built an entire culinary identity around an ingredient the North had spent 2 centuries calling deadly. The exception had become the template, and the template was about to go global. The United States was the last holdout among British-influenced North American populations. While Southern Europe had already built entire cuisines around the tomato, the former British colonies were still carrying the shadow of that herbal tradition into the 19th century. The poor ate them. The wealthy suspected them, and the gap between those two positions closed, slowly, over decades of immigrant kitchens and market stalls, doing what texts and herbalists never could, demonstrating, meal after meal, that nobody died. Those immigrant kitchens deserve more credit than history usually gives them. Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese families who arrived in American port cities brought their cooking with them, and that cooking included the red fruit as a matter of course. They did not arrive with a theory about why it was safe. They arrived with a recipe. And recipes, passed across back fences and through neighborhood markets, spread faster than any printed herbal ever could. The argument was not made in words. It was made in bowls of food handed to skeptical neighbors who found, to their surprise, that they were still alive the following morning. By the 1870s, that evidence had become undeniable. In 1876, H.J. Heinz bottled it. Tomato ketchup arrived on American tables, not as medicine, not as ornament, but as condiment. Mass-produced, shelf-stable, handed to a continent that had spent 2 centuries fearing the jar's main ingredient. Within a generation, it was in every diner, on every counter, beside every plate. Think about that arc. Aztec markets, Spanish ships, Italian gardens, French salons, and finally, a factory in Pittsburgh. Today, the world produces more than 192 million tons of tomatoes in a single year. One country alone, China, grows over 70 million of those. The crop that was called a weapon, a poison, a witch's tool, and, in a famous 1893 Supreme Court ruling that classified it for tariff purposes, a legal vegetable, now feeds every continent on Earth. It was there when Italy wrote its identity. It was there when America industrialized its appetite. It is sitting in your kitchen right now, the most feared food in European history, the most eaten food on the planet. For 200 years, the tomato was a symbol of fear, class anxiety, and botanical suspicion. Today, it is the most produced fruit on Earth, and the story of how that reversal happened is one of the strangest in the history of human appetite. The tomato took 200 years to go from poison to plate. Every food you eat without a second thought has a story just as strange. If you want to know what those stories are, subscribe to Tales of the Table, and we will keep telling them.